Dr. Janil, please.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here on a Saturday. I'm not a golfer either. If I wasn't here, I'd be doing a market visit to my constituency, but that's another story. My wife would say that I really should be at home supervising some of the activities my sons are getting up to, but I suspect if I was at home, that activity would be the PlayStation, but don't tell her that. So we're here to talk about disruption. And, I was listening to Warren's comments. And what was interesting was, of course, the media and the newsroom, of course, thrives on disruption. If there's no disruption, they wouldn't have much news to report. So for them, it's a double-edged sword. The increasing pace of disruption, Trudeau's comment, gives them more things to talk about and more stuff to report and put in their blog posts, on their websites, on their Twitter handles, come and give us challenging interviews. But then, unfortunately, when it comes home to their newsroom, it comes home to their organization, there are some downsides. And then they have to respond to that, which is one of the things that I'm going to bring up today, which is that when we talk about our wish for disruption, we must remember that it's not a simple thing to ask for, to implement, or to experience. And that there are some consequences that we need to be prepared to engage with. And if we are asking for our education system to be disrupted or to be disruptive, we also need to prepare ourselves to be the kind of society that can not just cope but embrace some of the consequences that happen as a result, including some of the perhaps slightly less pleasant. So I'm going to scope out a little bit of what I think that might look like. The other thing that I thought I might talk about today is what a disrupted or a disruptive education system does look like from the inside. If you're here living in Singapore, and let's say we had a forum in maybe a year or two, I mean, you don't have to take this up, SIM, but I'm just suggesting, and it was our disruptive or our disrupted education system. What would that look like? What would that feel like for the students, for the parents, for our society? Before I do that, I thought I might say a little bit about the forces of disruption. Actually, a lot has been said about this already in terms of the external forces that are driving this process of disruption, whether it's the interconnection with the rest of the world. Singapore, we did globalization long before it became a buzzword. We were an open economy. We brought MNCs, the best ideas from the world, trade, finance, and now increasingly data flows through us. We're connected and we're exposed to everything that happens around the world. We've talked about the external forces that are encouraging us to think about being disruptive. We've talked about the competition for business, for talent, for opportunity, compared to other cities, compared to our other jurisdictions. Again, another external force for us to be disrupted and disruptive. But I thought I might say a little bit about some of the potential internal forces. What is happening inside our classrooms, inside our schools, inside our education system, that also wants to be disruptive to ourselves. Let me start with the students. The students can be a disruptive force. I mean, anybody who's a parent of a 3-year-old will know that a 3-year-old can be disruptive. But the aspirations of this generation, the students, the 20-year-olds who have just come out of the formal education, the 15-year-olds who are coming to the end of their secondary education, but actually even the primary school students who are going in in P1, they can be a potential pressure on the types of disruptions that we need to think about. Why? Well, we are living in very peaceful, prosperous, stable times here in Singapore. So this generation growing up has never been healthier. They've never been exposed to as much reading, as much engaging opportunities in the kindergarten space. They have a sense of plenty. They have a sense of opportunity, partly driven by some parental expectations and some behavior around enrichment. But when they come to school, they're not quite the same as the generation before them. They're often ready and raring to go. They are connected. Whether you like it or not, kids spending a lot more time on the screens. One of my questions when I do my school visits is to ask the kids, how many of you have a mobile phone? And at what age did you start getting a mobile phone? And, in the last couple of years, the short time that I've been in education, it appears that second question is getting a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier. They're already connected. They are forming WhatsApp groups among themselves. My second son just started secondary 1 this year, and by the end of the 3rd day or 4th day, he had a little WhatsApp chat group with all of his classmates. And that connection amongst your class is quite different, and that has a force, a pressure on how the education system and how the teacher has to respond. The same son, who's just started in secondary 1, is still in contact with his primary school cohort through the same tool. Not that I'm advertising for WhatsApp. But what happens when 4 or 5 years later, that tight connection that he built at primary school continues to be reinforced on a daily basis? Because seriously, I mean, he spends out, daily he's putting message back and forth to his primary school cohort. So the lived experience of these kids is going to put some pressure on the education system to disrupt it ourselves, be responsive to the kind of aspirations, the kind of experiences that they have. But also, these kids are looking out across the world. They know what's happening in London, they know what's happening in Jakarta. They understand the conflicts that are out there, they understand the aspirational, inspirational movements that are happening around the world. And they want to be part of these types of movements as a connected, youthful society. That's going to put some pressure on the kind of skills, attitudes, and knowledge that we need to provide within the education service so that they can fulfill those aspirations. So our students can and should be a potential push and a force for positive disruption within the education service. Their parents can also be a force for disruption. The teachers in the room will have one view about this, because, as parent myself, we can also WhatsApp the teacher. Not always well received, but the aspirations of parents today are quite different. And we should, as an education service, respond to these to be disruptive around those aspirations in a positive way. Because the fundamental basis of that anxiety or the concern or the involvement for a parent actually hasn't changed. As the technology has rolled out, as our industries have rolled out, as our society has changed, what does a parent want? The parent wants for their child to have the best possible opportunity through education. And as they look in the economy and around the world, and jobs are changing, jobs are being lost, jobs are being created, new industries are being created, there's an anxiety that parents have. Will my child be able to navigate their way through the education system and find a meaningful opportunity later on? That fundamental aspiration hasn't changed. And we should always, as an education service, respond to that. The third disruptive force internally is our teachers. A young teacher graduating from teacher training today actually is already not in my generation. He or she's coming from the next generation, internet ready. They are plug and play, they're Wi-Fi enabled, they have grown up as the internet has taken off, they have grown up as that global connection has taken off, and they are bringing to bear in their classrooms that experience. They're not waiting for MOE to write the next app or persuade some vendor to come and deliver a service. They're just simply saying, how can I use Google Docs and WhatsApp and Facebook to derive a new learning experience? And they're just going ahead and innovating in their classrooms. And they, again, can be a potential force for positive disruption that we as the education should respond to. So, internal forces for disruption. So, what then would a disrupted and a disruptive education system look like across the landscape? Let me deal with some of the downsides first. What would happen if truly we were very disruptive to ourselves and disrupted to our education service? What would happen? What would happen to our students? What would happen to them as they navigate through the education space? And what happens when they leave? Well, fundamentally, it would mean that your outcome would be a little less guaranteed. Because the pace of disruption is picking up, and as the education service is responding to those disruptions, and industry is changing, if we were truly disruptive, changing our models of education delivery, our courses, our subjects, our evaluation systems, and our tools, well, when the students get to the end of it, not all of them will be ideally prepared for a job. There will be some that get matched into a job nicely, or their next course of higher education nicely, but there will be some that will need to take a little bit of time to find their way, a little bit of time to work out, well, I chose a really innovative pathway in school, which nobody else had done before, and the employer is just not yet ready to employ me. So I may take a little bit of time to find my job, or I might have to go and do some retraining. We will lose some efficiency, if you want to put it that way. What would it look like for the child? The child might have to deal with more anxiety. Says, this university offers this kind of course, and it's the only one offering this kind of course, but no one else has done this before. Is it a safe bet? Is it something that I can take a risk on? Will my parents let me do it? How do you then provide counseling from the education service to a child about a course that has never been done before? Says, you're now graduating from secondary school and you're going to this. I think you're a good fit, but really none of my previous students have done it before. You will be the first. But you need to be brave to try it. So there's going to be an increased anxiety. There's going to be an increased inefficiency. There's not going to be a guarantee that every experiment, every disruptive innovation that we try in the education service will work perfectly the first time. And so the downside is, a bit like the newsroom, we will have to think of strategies to cope. Not just celebrate all the good stuff, but cope with some of these inefficiencies and outcomes that we have to accept is part of that innovation and part of that disruption. But what's the good side? What's the positive side? Why is it worth taking those risks? Why is it worth dealing with some of those anxieties? And as a parent of 3 boys, I tell you, I got a lot of anxieties on a daily basis. Why is it worth doing it? Well, Warren talked a little bit about this. We need to prepare our students for a very different type of world. We need to build in them the resilience and adaptability that if it takes a little bit longer to get exactly the right track to follow your passion, that's okay, and be a bit more resilient about it. If you need to try something and fail and then try something different, that's okay. We need to give them different types of skills and aptitudes and attitudes. So it's worth doing it because if we get it right, we build the next generation and every generation thereafter to be even more future ready, even more resilient, and more able to take on these opportunities in the world. But what does that space in between look like? We talked about the forces and we talked about the outcome. What does a disruptive and disrupted education system look like? Well, the first thing is, it cannot be the same across the whole education service. It must actually look increasingly diverse across different schools, different polys, ITE, the university courses, the JCs. Everything has to look a little bit more colorful because you can't have a one-size-fits-all solution, whether you're talking about technology, whether you're talking about a classroom innovation, whether you're talking about the type of subject that you deliver. So, if someone stands up and says, I can solve this problem of disruption and resilience, just buy my product, they may be right. They may be absolutely right, but they'll be right at that point in time, and they'll be right for that problem. But how can we make sure that year on year, the education service responds and remains resilient? Well, it needs to be diverse. So the second thing is that disrupted and disruptive education service, the barriers need to be broken down. The learning mustn't stop at the school gates. Industry must be brought into the classroom, and the classroom must be taken out towards industry. Because we want our education to be responsive to the needs of what's happening within society. So whether it's at the level of community service or whether at the level of industry engagement, a disrupted and disruptive education service is integrated into the industry and the community around them. We have a number of examples of this happening already today. Actually, if you look at it, our education service is very variegated. We have many tracks, many courses. Singaporean parents, you'll know, you have so many choices of which secondary school to apply for, which poly courses to apply for, the different paths and different tracks. MOE tried to make a very nice picture of all the different pathways, and actually I think it looked far worse because it was a very confusing series of lines. It looked like, how do I make a choice? It's so confusing, right? It's a very diverse landscape out there. But I think far more important as a marker of that disrupted and disruptive space that currently exists in Singapore is what the students and the teachers are already doing. So I just have a few examples I want to throw out there just to show you what's happening already. The extent to which open source solutions are being used. And we track this. Schools that are using, as I use the examples, Google Docs, WhatsApp, but they're building their own. There's an open source physics platform that many schools and JCs are coming on board with. There are 100 teachers and 10,000 students since 2012. The extent to which they are using existing mobile applications, Class Dojo, WhatsApp, again Facebook, and tracking the learning through that, developing real-world integrations around programming and coding. And they're doing this not because MOE said so, but because the teachers see educational value at taking those tools and layering them into their courses. But we are saying so. What does the Ministry of Education and the government do to push this? Well, we provide quite a lot of funds to encourage research in teaching innovation. We have the course-based customization that NTU is doing through technology-enhanced learning, transforming 1,500 courses. Environment-based customization that ITE is getting involved in. But we are also putting quite a lot of money into tertiary education research. We've committed, I think, 42 projects, 15 of which are looking at ICT, to try to drive and say, look, if you're going to do this kind of innovation, how do you do it in a way that tells us what the data is, tells us what the impact on student learning is. We've had Opals, some of you who may be familiar with the Education Service, an online platform for learning, which has been years. It's sort of from an old bulletin board system. We've had all of these tools and products, so much so that you know what happens in one classroom in the same school is really quite different from what happens in the adjacent classroom in the same school, never mind across different schools across the whole landscape. Our teachers have been able to differentiate learning in the classroom across time. And an individual child has been able to find his or her way through a path which is maybe not perfectly fitting to them, but appropriate to them, to their aspirations and the overall needs of their education. That's a disruptive and a disrupted society, education service. I believe we have done quite a lot, but we can continue to do more, because it's not a thing that we should ever sit back and say we've done a great job and that's the end of it. We've got the good foundations in place where teachers and schools feel that they own this problem and that they are empowered to then innovate at the school level, at the classroom level. We at MOE need to provide them the tools and the funding and the space in order to do so, and we are doing so. One example is the student learning space that we are building, rolling out by the end of 2018. We've already piloted it. It sounds very simple, that it delivers all your resources online. So if you have a learning plan, lessons, curriculum, content, evaluation, you as a student will be able to access all of this online. But more importantly, once you make something available, it's potentially available across the whole education landscape to every single school in Singapore. It also allows the students to talk to each other and the teachers to talk to each other, bringing together that communal aspect and the data-driven aspect. What works well, why doesn't it work well? And then we can put evaluations in. So that's something that MOE is building. It's not just about putting the money there, it's not just about putting the policy there, but putting the tools and products for this type of disruption to take root and to continually occur over time. So I hope we have a disruptive education service already. I think we can do more to learn from the best lessons from around the world. A forum like this today is something that we should embrace, and it's part of our tradition in Singapore and in our education service to continually look around and see what are the best models from around the world, what are the best aspects, and how can we bring them here to benefit our society and our students. We should continue to do so. I think the day that we say that we are already disrupted and disruptive and our education service is as good as it can get, we will lose a certain edge, and I think we will only start to slow down and lose the opportunity to re-engineer ourselves for the future. We must remain open to these types of new ideas and continue to update and innovate for our education service. I'm looking forward to the comments and the discussion today, and thank you all very much for your time. Thank you.